Season 2 of House of the Dragon is almost here, and if you've watched my previous videos, you probably know that I'm overall pretty hyped about that. However, there was a couple things within the last week that I saw that made me start to worry just a little bit for the first time about Season 2, and so I looked into them a little bit more, and today I'd like to talk about what I found. Now, don't worry, this isn't a video that's intending to kill your hype or anything like that or complain for no good reason. I'm talking just about a few creative choices and how they may or may not work out. And one of the two, as of now, I'm no longer worried about at all because I think I know which direction it's going. And the other one, I'll be honest, I am still a little bit worried about, but I don't necessarily think, even if it is true that it's going to ruin the show or anything like that, it's just something that I'm not a huge fan of. So, the first thing that I wanted to talk about was an article headline that I saw that said the producers of season 2 of House of the Dragon said that the reduced episode count wasn't their choice. The article goes on to mention that basically they said the reduction from 10 episodes to 8 episodes was not a creative call, and it really wasn't their choice. So, upon reading that, I was definitely a little bit concerned. Something that I think can really often hurt a show, especially an adaptation, is someone like the network or whoever's in charge of the money being like, we don't have the budget for 10 episodes, fit it down into 8. Or something like that, right? We don't have the time slots, we don't have the budget. Whatever it is, right? It can really hurt a show if you take 10 episodes worth of material and try to somehow write it down into only 8. A recent example of a show that I think was done a disservice by having too few episodes and therefore had to sort of rush the writing and rush a lot of the character development and combine a bunch of plot lines that didn't deserve to be combined. Just take a look at Netflix's live action Avatar The Last Airbender. I definitely didn't completely hate the show or anything like that. I thought it was mostly alright, but a lot of the problems that I did have with it came from the fact that they were rushing a lot of things, they didn't have as much character development as they could have had, and I really do think a lot of the problems of the writing and everything like that could have been solved by having maybe 12 episodes instead of 8. I really just think that for all of these networks that are trying to produce the next Game of Thrones, the next really big hit that really takes over, is you have to definitely allow them the time that they need to tell whatever story they need to tell. Season 1 of Game of Thrones is widely considered to be one of the best adaptations from book to television, basically ever. Everyone really loves Season 1, I don't think that that's an unpopular opinion anywhere. Now, imagine what would have happened if HBO had decided, we don't have enough confidence in this, we aren't sure if this is going to be a hit or not. Make it happen in 6 episodes. You get a budget for 6 episodes. Well, I don't think that there's any chance that season 1 of Game of Thrones would have been as good if they had had to limit it down to 6 episodes. The fallout of that, if they had made a worse season 1 of Game of Thrones, is I don't know that Game of Thrones would have ever become Game of Thrones, the big cultural phenomenon that it eventually became. As someone who really loves the original Avatar and was hoping that the new Avatar, the live action one, could be sort of the next Game of Thrones, I am a little bit worried that Netflix sort of shot themselves in the foot here. I worry that they took an IP that did definitely have that potential to grip people in the same way that Game of Thrones did, and then they sort of rushed it by not giving the story as much time as it needed and by combining so many plot lines into so few episodes. I feel like they didn't give people a real chance to live in that world and sort of get invested the way that early Game of Thrones allowed people to do. I'll save the specifics about Avatar Season 1 for a different video where I'll talk just about Avatar. Let me know down in the comments and make sure you're subscribed if that would be something you're interested in. But mainly, the point is that when I saw that Season 2 of House of the Dragon was on a reduced episode count and it allegedly was not the choice of the producers, I started to worry a little bit. So, as I looked into it more, the thing that made me no longer worried about this reduced episode count was reading some interviews with people like Ryan Condal and watching some videos by channels like The Dragon Demands. The vibe that I get now is that this is actually potentially sort of a less is more type of situation. We may be getting less episodes, but it definitely seems like HBO, having seen that season 1 was a hit, is eventually going to have more seasons of House of the Dragon than was originally planned. If true, this would mean that basically the story is not being rushed or condensed or anything like that that I was originally worried about just from seeing that first quote. Basically, what seems to be happening is that the story is actually being given more time to tell what needs to be told, rather than, say, a 10 episode season that would have moved us further along into the story. we are getting 2 8-episode seasons that will be a little more slow paced and give things a little bit more time. In season 1 terms, imagine if instead of having young Rhaenyra and Alicent for the first half of the season and then halfway through they age up the actresses, and it's basically like a different second half of the season. Imagine if they had lengthened both of those out into 2 8-episode seasons, one with the first set of actresses and one with the second. Now, I don't know that you would have necessarily needed to do that with season 1, but I would certainly have preferred them doing that to, say, having to shrink down season 1 into fewer episodes. Overall, I'm much more optimistic about that idea. And another thing that it obviously brings to mind is the late seasons of Game of Thrones. One of the most common complaints about the later seasons of Game of Thrones, and something I definitely agree was a problem, is just how rushed everything felt. I was one of those people who was basically of the opinion that I was fine with basically where everyone ended up, but man, the way that you got there in the actual television show was not very satisfying. It didn't feel like Game of Thrones that we had gotten used to. It didn't feel like a show worth investing in the characters and trying to figure out what they're going to do next because it didn't really matter what they were going to do next. There was no logic behind it, there was no character motivation behind it. It was just we had to get to the end, so we're going to get to the end. The throwing out the well set up character motivations and interworking puzzle pieces that made the show so interesting in the early seasons and made it so fun to theorize about is something that I think could have been fixed if they had taken more time, done more seasons, more episodes, things like that, and actually worked in proper character motivations and proper setup for all of the actions that the characters eventually ended up taking. And the wild thing about this to me is the fact that HBO wanted more seasons and more episodes, George R. R. Martin wanted more seasons and more episodes. It was just D&D who eventually got to make the final call. And apparently, from what I remember, they initially planned on having only 7 seasons and were convinced by HBO to split it into a shortened season 7 and 8. This was basically the compromise between HBO wanting the show to go much longer and D&D wanting it to be over. Now, I don't know about you, but I honestly can't imagine how horrible and rushed everything would have been if they had tried to fit all of that into even less episodes. It was bad enough as it is, but I can't imagine what they were planning to do with only 7 seasons. It really does seem to me that the best case scenario would have been going with what HBO and George R. R. Martin were pushing for, which was more seasons to actually properly develop these characters and have their actions make more sense, and the worst case scenario was something that we actually managed to avoid thanks to HBO finally convincing D&D to go more episodes. As much as I thought the later seasons of Game of Thrones were really rushed and didn't make much sense character-wise, I am really not envious of the people living in the alternate timeline where HBO didn't even get their compromise solution of 8 seasons, and all of this was rushed through even faster. So, how all of this applies to future seasons of House of the Dragon, I think that of the 2 options on the table, what is more likely happening is HBO is telling them, hey, spread this out over more seasons, take your time with all of this stuff, we want this to actually have time to be done properly, rather than them saying, hey, you need to rush through this in fewer episodes. Not only because that was what they were doing in the original Game of Thrones, once they realized they had a hit on their hands, they wanted more time taken, they wanted more seasons, they wanted more total episodes, but also because they learned their lesson from not getting their way with Game of Thrones. It would, to me, be a wild turn of events for them to have witnessed all of the backlash to Season 8 and how rushed everything was, having been correct in their assessment that it needed more time and more episodes, to then turn around and do the opposite thing with the next series. I mentioned I was also more optimistic having seen something that Ryan Condal said in an interview. And what he said is that in medieval times, war took a long time. It was slow to raise armies and get around the map and things like that. You're not going to have people teleporting all over the place like you did in the later seasons of Game of Thrones. This was a quote that was originally brought to my attention in a Dragon Demands video about how basically just what I said, you're not going to have people teleporting all over the place. And to me, that is just more evidence that yes, they're going to take this more slow paced, they're going to take this more seriously, they're going to treat this more like the early seasons of Game of Thrones, which is something that I can really, really get behind. I'm a simple man, I just want my shows with dragons fighting dragons to be realistic. And as of now, it seems like House of the Dragon is committed to fulfilling that desire. Definitely let me know what you think of that whole reading of the situation down in the comments. Am I crazy? Am I not? I don't know, but for now at least I'm choosing to remain optimistic that this is actually a good thing for the series. Even though normally I would be very skeptical of the idea of a show being reduced from 10 episodes down to 8. So that covers the first of the two things that I have seen recently that started to get me a little bit concerned about season 2. Now, the other one is a little bit more spoilery as it involves a leak and a character who may not be appearing in the show, and someone who may be taking their place, so if you want to completely avoid spoilers, now would be the time to probably go. Now, if you have seen the news that I'm about to talk about, just based on what I just said, you probably know where I'm going next. There was a leak that basically says that Nettles, one of the dragon seeds who tames a dragon called Sheepstealer, has been cut. Apparently, her place will be taken by one of Damon's daughters who will tame Sheepstealer out in the Vale. Now, we don't know for sure that this is true, but it would definitely seem to line up with a few other things that have happened. For example, there has been no known Nettles casting, and there has been no sightings of Nettles other than some potential pictures that maybe could be Nettles, but no one's really sure, and many people were speculating that maybe Nettles had been pushed off to season 3, but it might turn out that in fact she's just not going to appear in the show at all. Now, I personally am pretty bummed out about this. I was really looking forward to seeing Nettles. I think her taming of Sheepstealer is one of the more interesting storylines that we would have seen in the show, but apparently we're not going to get to see it. Just very quickly, for those of you who may not be aware, the thing that's so interesting to me about Nettle's taming of Sheepstealer is how differently the taming went to a normal dragon bonding situation. The normal way of bonding with a dragon seems to involve Valyrian blood and some sort of magical telepathic connection that's not completely dissimilar from warging. In season 1, we saw Daemon singing a song to an untamed dragon, and he seemed to be singing, at least to me, lyrics that would imply some sort of consciousness merge that he was preparing the dragon for. I have some older videos on my channel about that, about the three heads of the dragon and the consciousness bond that seemed to be implied by that song, so you can check them out after this if you haven't seen them. But personally, I think it would have been pretty interesting to see that there is actually another way to do this, and that someone who is not of Valyrian descent could potentially tame a dragon, because many people don't believe that Nettles is of Valyrian descent. Now, in terms of why she would have been cut, I could sort of see this going a couple different ways. Now, one of them, which I really hope is not the case, is the idea that, well, there would just be too many characters. If we can combine some characters, we should do that because we don't need so many different characters. People would get confused, all that sort of blah, 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 late seasons Game of Thrones stuff. The combining and cutting out of book characters in the later seasons of Game of Thrones is, I think, one of the first signs that we got that the show was on the decline. The first big one for me was the non-reveal of Lady Stoneheart in the television show. When it got to the moment where Lady Stoneheart should have showed up, and then she just never did, all of a sudden me and my friend who had read the books were just looking at each other going, oh no, what are they doing? Surely she'll be coming next season. And then she never came next season either, and it was all really just downhill from there. Now, I don't know that I would say Nettles reaches the level of importance or the level of coolness of a character like Lady Stoneheart, considering Stoneheart was basically the continuation of the story of one of our main characters, Catelyn Stark, and how much importance she has in the plot of several other characters like Jaime and Brienne. But I will definitely say hearing the news that Nettles has likely been cut from the show is definitely giving me a bit of PTSD flashbacks to the lack of Lady Stoneheart and then all the eventual problems that came from other cutting of characters in the later seasons of Game of Thrones. And it's for reasons like that that I am really actually hoping this leak isn't true, and I'm really hoping that we do get Nettles, even if it isn't in season 2, maybe in season 3, but if Sheepstealer is claimed by one of Daemon's daughters in season 2, then that's obviously very unlikely to happen. So that leads us to the second reason that Nettles could have been cut, which I will call the most boring reason, and that would be that Nettles is actually just straight up a Valyrian bastard, potentially even one of Daemon's bastard daughters, which has been speculated before, and that the entire reason she's been cut is just because they're just giving that plotline to a different one of Daemon's daughters. Now, if this is the case, then it makes it less of a terrible decision, in my opinion, to just completely cut Nettles. I still don't agree with it, but it's less terrible. It will, however, lead to different problems down the line, which is something that I'll touch on before the end of the video. but at the same time, you're basically just swapping one Valyrian girl for another who claims this dragon. It is less impactful potentially because she didn't grow up poor and on the streets, like the case would be with Nettles, but at the same time, is it that big of a deal? Maybe not. So then that brings me to my third possible reason I could see for Nettles being cut. It's not that she is so similar to all of the other Valyrians who claim a dragon and that it's more simple than we were making it out to be in the books. It's actually the opposite. That what she did is some crazy weird magic, and when George R. R. Martin explained it to them, they were just like, yeah, we're not going to go and bother to explain all of that in the television show. In World, there are people who think that Nettles is using some sort of strange sorcery or weird magic to bind the dragon to her will that is not the same as a normal Valyrian dragon bond. There are also people who have speculated in the past that Nettles could potentially be a child of the forest who is using some sort of old god's magic and claiming a dragon for child of the forest purposes. Something that I find personally very interesting and have even talked about in previous videos on my channel. I actually think that if this is the case, it could be George doing some world building to set up for a potential reveal that could be coming in Winds of Winter or Dream of Spring, and if that is the case, then I could sort of see why they would cut it from House of the Dragon, because they didn't end up doing that reveal in the television show Game of Thrones, so it would be a bit of world building for some setup that never came, and therefore would be a bunch of extra explanation for something that doesn't end up mattering in the television show canon and would just feel really weird and out of place. Basically, they don't want to do a bunch of extra setup and potentially confuse the audience and add a bunch of different magical elements that don't have a payoff in their own series, because Nettles sort of just disappears from the series, which is the thing that could leave her around to be paid off later on in the main series, but then they didn't actually use that payoff in the show Game of Thrones, so then the whole setup payoff thing, it just doesn't make any sense, and therefore it would be needlessly complicated, and that could be why they cut it. So basically, the options as I see it again are just that they feel like there was too many characters, and therefore it was better to combine some characters, which would make me a little bit concerned because I don't think that's the case, and I think you're cutting one of the cooler characters for no real reason. Or it could be that Nettles isn't nearly as cool as people have built her up to be in the books because she's so mysterious and there are so many unanswered questions, and therefore the answers would maybe be less satisfying, and she actually turns out to just be a normal Valyrian, and potentially even one of Daemon's own daughters, so why not just give that plot line to one of Daemon's established daughters who isn't really doing much, and therefore it makes it a little bit more entertaining for the other daughter of Daemon, at the cost of a character who may have underwhelmed in the end anyway. I don't really agree with that decision. If that is the decision they made, I think they could have just stuck to what actually happens in the source material, but it is what it is. And then the final option is that she is not boring. In fact, she is so crazy and out of left field that they're just like, yo, George, this is way too wild and out of nowhere, and then it sort of disappears into nowhere. We're just going to streamline this a little bit and not have any of that stuff. In any of these three cases, I could see some argument for cutting Nettles, but in all three of these cases, I don't think that it's actually the best decision. I think that I always lean towards the idea that Nettles should have been kept in. Now, I did mention earlier that I would get to some problems that this is going to cause down the line in the television show if they do indeed cut Nettles. And this is going to revolve around the specific circumstances, shall we say, around Nettles' departure from the story. So, if you don't want spoilers on any of that, one more warning that you could get out of here. But basically, what happens is that Nettles and Damon are rumored to be lovers. Some people think that they're father and daughter, but some people think that they are lovers. One of the characters in World who supposedly starts to buy into these rumors that they are in fact lovers is Rhaenyra, who, obviously being married to Daemon, isn't too fond of that. This causes Rhaenyra to allegedly order the execution of Nettles, which causes Nettles to then hop on the back of Sheepstealer and fly off to never be seen again, at least not during the dance. This obviously takes a dragon out of play that was on Rhaenyra's side, which feels like kind of a big deal that they're going to have to somehow make happen in the television show as well. They're going to have to deal with that somehow. And in addition to this, Rhaenyra is obviously pissed off at Daemon, and after the ordered execution, Daemon is mad at Rhaenyra. It turns out that women don't like it when you cheat on them, and men don't like it when you try to kill their girlfriend, and or daughter, and or dragon riding buddy. This rift between Damon and Rhaenyra is at least somewhat important near the end of the dance, and it is, shall we say, a negative effect on her mental health. Now, there are many other things that are going on at the time which I will not mention because I'm not going to get more spoilery than I have to for this video, but at the same time, it's going to be very weird to see how they handle this potential situation if they replace Nettles with someone who is known to be one of Daemon's daughters, therefore removing that suspicion from Rhaenyra. They have to sort of build a different plot in its place to have that same sort of result happen, and if they're going to do that, why not just keep the original plot? At least that's my opinion. Now, these are professional writers, and so I will give them the benefit of the doubt that they have thought through where this is all going to go, even though doing that and giving that benefit of the doubt with Game of Thrones sort of bit me in the ass because they didn't have a lot of things planned out. They were making changes that ended up just making everything worse. But so far, House of the Dragon has been pretty solid, so like I said, we'll see where they go with it. I'm not a huge fan of this, but I don't think it's going to ruin the series if this ends up being true, but I'm interested to know what you all think of it down in the comments. Maybe give me your concern meter from like 1 to 10. How much does this concern you, and any potential thoughts you have as to how they would go about this, future changes that this would lead to down the road, and things like that. And while you're down there, make sure to like and subscribe if you've made it this far into the video. Season 2 is going to be coming soon, and there will be plenty to talk about. But that's where I'm going to leave it for now, and I'll be back with something else very soon.